In the shadow of the Rockies, where the mining town of Blackwater Creek clung to life like rust on iron, a transaction took place that would reshape the very fabric of the American frontier. It wasn't gold that changed hands that bitter March evening in 1847. It was flesh and blood, wrapped in a threadbare shawl, weighing no more than a bag of grain. The price? A single silver dollar, tossed carelessly onto a saloon table stained with whiskey and broken dreams. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The buyer was Ezekiel Thorne, a man whose shadow could eclipse a church steeple, whose hands could crush stones to powder, and whose heart had been carved hollow by a war that had taken everything from him. The seller was desperation itself, wearing the face of a broken Lakota warrior who had gambled away his last shred of honor. And the merchandise? A 7-year-old girl named Ayanna, whose dark eyes held storms that hadn't yet learned to thunder. What happened next would become legend whispered in saloons from Colorado to California, carved into the memories of those who witnessed the rise of the most feared warrior the West had ever known. But legends, like scars, tell only part of the story. The truth is always bloodier. The wind howled through Blackwater Creek like a banshee seeking vengeance, carrying with it the scent of sulfur from the mines and the promise of another brutal winter. Inside Murphy's saloon, the air hung thick with tobacco smoke and the sour stench of unwashed bodies pressed too close together. Men huddled around tables, their faces lit by the amber glow of oil lamps, their voices reduced to conspiratorial murmurs as they wagered their meager earnings on cards that seemed perpetually stacked against them. Ezekiel Thorne occupied the corner table alone, as he always did. At 6 feet and 8 inches, with shoulders broad enough to bear a coffin, he was a man who commanded space simply by existing. His weathered hands, scarred from years of working the mines, dwarfed the whiskey glass before him. Each finger was thick as a man's thumb, each knuckle a testament to violence both given and received. His beard, black as coal dust, couldn't quite hide the jagged scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a souvenir from Antietam, where he'd left his faith in God and his belief in the goodness of men buried beneath Confederate soil. The war had ended 2 years ago, but for Ezekiel, it raged on in the depths of his dreams. He'd returned to Colorado Territory to find his homestead burned, his wife Sarah's grave marked only by a weathered cross, and his young son Thomas claimed by the cholera that had swept through the territory like the angel of death. The mountains that had once promised him refuge now felt like a prison, and the silver he pulled from their depths tasted like ash in his mouth. Tonight, however, the saloon's usual rhythm was disrupted by the presence of a stranger. Joseph Crow Feather sat at the bar, his weathered leather coat hanging loose on his diminished frame, his long black hair streaked with premature gray. Once he had been a warrior among the Lakota, his name spoken with respect around council fires. Now he was just another broken man seeking solace in the bottom of a bottle, his heritage reduced to a curiosity for the white miners who regarded him with a mixture of fear and contempt. Crow Feather had been drinking steadily since sunset, his silver coins disappearing one by one across the bar to Mickey Murphy, the Irish proprietor who served liquor with the same dispassionate efficiency with which he'd once served British landlords back in County Cork. The Lakota's hands shook as he raised his glass, and his words slurred together in a language that shifted between English and his native tongue, creating a private poetry of despair. "Another," Crow Feather demanded, slapping his palm against the bar with enough force to rattle the glasses. But when Mickey extended his hand, palm up, the warrior's pockets yielded nothing but lint and broken dreams. "That's all the credit you're getting tonight, Joseph," Mickey said, his Irish accent thick with both sympathy and resignation. "Come back when you've got coins to match your thirst." Crow Feather's eyes swept the saloon, taking in the faces of men who had known him as a guide, a translator, a bridge between worlds. Now they looked away, unwilling to meet his gaze, uncomfortable with the sight of a proud man reduced to begging. His desperation was a mirror they didn't want to look into, reflecting their own precarious existence in this godforsaken corner of the territory. That it was then that Crow Feather's attention fell upon the small figure huddled in the corner near the door. Ayanna sat on a wooden crate, her thin legs drawn up to her chest, her dark eyes watching the room with the wary intelligence of a wild animal. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, but her face already carried the weight of someone who had seen too much of the world's cruelty. Her dress, once white, was now the color of dust and neglect, and her small hands were wrapped around a corn-husk doll that had seen better decades. She was Crow Feather's daughter, though the blood between them was more complicated than simple paternity. Her mother had been Yellow Bird, a Lakota woman who had died birthing her, leaving Crow Feather to raise the child alone in a world that was rapidly disappearing beneath the boots of westward expansion. He had named her Ayanna, meaning eternal, blossom, hoping that she might flourish where so many others had withered. But hope, like whiskey, was a luxury that required payment, and Crow Feather's accounts were overdrawn. "The girl," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the saloon's ambient noise like a blade through silk. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, cards remained suspended in air, and even the clock above the bar seemed to pause in its ticking. "The girl is worth something." Mickey Murphy's face went pale, and he reached across the bar as if to physically restrain the words that had already escaped. "Joseph, no. Don't do this thing." But Crow Feather was beyond restraint, beyond reason, beyond the last thin line that separated a man from the abyss. He turned to face the room, his arms spread wide like a preacher addressing his congregation. "Who wants to buy a Lakota girl?" he announced, his voice carrying the false bravado of a man who has already lost everything and has nothing left to lose. "She's young, she's strong, she'll work hard. She won't cause trouble." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how low a man could fall before he shattered completely. Ayanna looked up at her father, her dark eyes wide with confusion and the first stirrings of fear. She didn't understand all the words, but she understood the tone, and the tone in her father's voice was the sound of goodbye. It was Ezekiel Thorne who finally broke the silence. His chair scraped against the wooden floor as he stood, his massive frame unfolding like a mountain deciding to walk. Every eye in the saloon turned to him, and men who had known him for years suddenly found themselves seeing a stranger. There was something different in his expression, something that hadn't been there moments before, a spark of interest, perhaps, or maybe just the recognition of an opportunity. "How much?" Ezekiel asked, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. "Crow." Feather's eyes lit up with the desperate hope of a drowning man who sees a rope. She's worth at least $50, maybe more. Look at her, she's got good bones, strong hands. Should grow into a fine woman." But Ezekiel was already shaking his head, his dark eyes never leaving Ayanna's face. The girl stared back at him with the unflinching directness of childhood, seeing not a giant, but simply another adult in a world where adults made decisions that children had to live with. $1, Ezekiel said, reaching into his vest pocket and withdrawing a single silver coin. It caught the lamplight and threw it back in sharp, glittering fragments. "That's my offer." The insult of it hung in the air like smoke. Crow Feather's face flushed with shame and anger, but his need was stronger than his pride. He looked at his daughter, then at the coin, then back at his daughter. In that moment, everyone in the saloon could see the exact instant when Joseph Crow Feather's soul cracked in half. "She's my blood," he whispered, but his hand was already reaching for the coin. "Blood doesn't pay for whiskey," Ezekiel replied, his voice devoid of judgment or emotion. He wasn't being cruel. Cruelty required passion, and passion was a luxury he could no longer afford. He was simply stating a fact, as immutable as the law of gravity or the price of silver. The transaction was completed in silence. Crow Feather's fingers closed around the coin, and Ezekiel walked over to where Ayanna sat. He knelt down, bringing his massive frame closer to her level, and extended his hand. She looked at it for a long moment, then at her father, who couldn't meet her eyes. "Come on, girl," Ezekiel said softly. "We're going home." Ayanna stood slowly, clutching her cornhusk doll against her chest. She didn't cry. Tears were another luxury she'd learned to live without. Instead, she walked to Ezekiel's side, her small hand disappearing completely when she placed it in his massive palm. As they walked toward the door, Crow Feather called out one last time, "Her name is Ayanna." "It means, I know what it means," Ezekiel interrupted, not turning around. "It means eternal blossom." The door swung shut behind them, and the saloon remained silent for a long time after they'd gone. Men stared into their drinks, seeing reflections they didn't like, while Crow Feather sat alone at the bar, the silver dollar growing warm in his clenched fist. Outside, the wind had died down, and the stars were beginning to appear between the racing clouds. Ezekiel and Ayanna walked through the muddy streets of Blackwater Creek, their footsteps echoing off the wooden buildings like a heartbeat. The girl's legs were short, and she had to take 3 steps for every one of his, but she kept pace without complaint. Ezekiel's cabin sat at the edge of town, perched on a small rise that overlooked the creek from which the settlement took its name. It was a simple structure, built from logs he'd cut himself, with a stone chimney that sent smoke curling up into the night sky. The interior was spartanly furnished: a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a few shelves lined with books that he'd read so many times their spines had worn smooth. He lit a fire in the stone fireplace while Ayanna stood in the doorway, still clutching her doll. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and for a moment, the cabin felt almost warm, almost like a home. "Are you hungry?" Ezekiel asked, glancing over his shoulder at the girl. Ayanna nodded, her first real response since leaving the saloon. He opened a can of beans and heated them over the fire, then cut thick slices of bread from a loaf that was only slightly stale. They ate in silence, the girl's small hands wrapped around the tin plate, her dark eyes never leaving his face. When they finished eating, Ezekiel stood and began arranging blankets on the floor near the fireplace. "You can sleep here," he said. "It's warm, and the floor's not too hard." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ayanna nodded again and settled onto the makeshift bed, her cornhusk doll tucked under her arm like a talisman. Ezekiel blew out the oil lamp and retreated to his own bed, the rope springs creaking under his weight. For a long time, he lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the girl's breathing as it gradually slowed and deepened. He had bought her for $1, but he didn't know why. Perhaps it was the way she had looked at him without fear, or the way she had stood when he'd called her name. Perhaps it was simply that he recognized something in her eyes, the same hollow emptiness that stared back at him from his shaving mirror each morning. Or perhaps it was because, for the first time in 2 years, he had felt something other than the crushing weight of his own solitude. Not happiness that was still beyond his reach, but something else. Responsibility, maybe. Or purpose. The fire burned low, casting the cabin in deeper shadows, and outside the wind began to pick up again, whistling through the gaps in the logs like a lament for all the things that had been lost and could never be found again. In the morning, Ezekiel would begin the process of trying to understand what he had done, and what it meant to have a Lakota girl named Ayanna sleeping by his fireplace. But for now, in the darkness of his cabin, with the sound of another human being breathing nearby, Ezekiel Thorne allowed himself to close his eyes and dream of something other than war. Dawn broke over, Blackwater Creek like a reluctant promise, painting the sky in shades of rust and copper that matched the mineral-stained rocks littering the mountainside. Ezekiel woke to find Ayanna already awake, sitting cross-legged by the dying embers of the fire, her corn-husk doll balanced on her knees as she stared into the glowing coals with the intensity of someone reading prophecies in the flames. "You're up early," he said, his voice gravelly from sleep and whiskey. She turned to look at him, and he noticed for the first time that her eyes weren't just dark, they were the color of obsidian, black and reflective, holding depths that seemed impossible in someone so young. She didn't speak, but she nodded, a gesture that somehow conveyed more than words could have. Ezekiel rolled out of bed and began his morning routine, the same ritual he'd performed every day for 2 years. He washed his face in the basin, shaved with the straight razor that had belonged to his father, and dressed in the rough wool clothes that marked him as a man who worked with his hands. Throughout it all, Ayanna watched him with the focused attention of a student memorizing a lesson. "You speak English?" he asked as he pulled on his boots. "Some," she replied, her voice soft but clear. It was the first word she'd spoken in his presence, and it carried the musical cadence of her native tongue wrapped around English syllables. He nodded and moved to the stove, where he began preparing breakfast. Cornmeal mush, fried salt pork, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. As he worked, he became aware of Ayanna moving around the cabin, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She wasn't exploring, she was observing, cataloging, learning the geography of her new world. "What happened to your family?" she asked suddenly, the question cutting through the morning silence like a blade through silk. Ezekiel's hand stilled on the coffee pot. It was a child's question, direct and unfiltered by adult social conventions. He could have deflected, could have told her it wasn't her concern, could have retreated into the silence that had become his constant companion. Instead, he found himself answering. "War took them," he said simply. "War and sickness and all the things that follow in their wake." Ayanna nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense, as if she had expected nothing else from a world that had taught her that love was a luxury measured in silver dollars. They ate breakfast in companionable silence, the girl's small hands managing the tin spoon with careful precision. When they finished, Ezekiel stood and reached for his coat, the heavy canvas garment that would protect him from the mountain's teeth. "I have to go to work," he said. "The mines won't dig themselves." Ayanna looked up at him, her dark eyes questioning. "You'll stay here," he continued. "There's food in the pantry, books on the shelf if you can read them. Don't wander into town. The men there aren't kind to your people." She nodded again, that same gesture that seemed to contain multitudes. As he reached for the door, she spoke again. "What do you want me to become?" The question stopped him cold. He turned back to look at her, this small girl who had been sold for the price of a drink, who sat in his cabin like a riddle waiting to be solved. "I want you to survive," he said finally. "Everything else is up to you." The Silver Crown mine was a wound in the earth's flesh, a gaping maw that consumed men and machinery with equal indifference. Ezekiel descended into its depths with the automatic movements of long practice, his miner's lamp casting dancing shadows on the tunnel walls. The air was thick with dust and the promise of cave-ins, and the constant drip of water from the ceiling marked time like a funeral march. He worked alone, as he always did, his powerful shoulders driving the pickaxe into the silver-veined rock with mechanical precision. Other miners gave him a wide berth, intimidated by his size and the aura of barely contained violence that seemed to radiate from his massive frame. They whispered about him in the darkness, trading stories about the war, about the things he'd done, about the way he'd lost his family and his mind in equal measure. But today, as he worked, Ezekiel found his thoughts drifting to the girl in his cabin. What was she doing? Was she afraid? Had he made a mistake, buying her like livestock, bringing her into his world of isolation and grief? The questions followed him through the tunnels, echoing off the walls like the voices of ghosts. By the time he emerged from the mine, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. His body ached from the day's labor, and his lungs burned with each breath of the clean mountain air. He expected to find Ayanna where he'd left her, perhaps reading one of his books or playing with her doll. Instead, he returned to find his cabin transformed. The floors had been swept clean, the dishes washed and put away, and his clothes folded with military precision. The fire had been banked to perfect coals, and the air smelled of something that might have been soup. Ayanna stood at the stove, stirring a pot with the same focused intensity she'd shown when watching the flames that morning. She had somehow conjured a meal from his meager supplies, rabbit stew, thick with vegetables and herbs that she must have gathered from the mountainside. "How did you catch the rabbit?" he asked, genuinely curious. She turned to look at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, something that might have been a smile flickered across her features. "Traps," she said simply. "My father taught me before he forgot who he was." They ate the stew in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the morning's warmer, more comfortable, like the quiet between old friends. The food was better than anything Ezekiel had eaten in months, seasoned with herbs that turned the simple ingredients into something approaching a feast. "You don't have to work," he said as they finished eating. "You're not my slave." Ayanna looked at him with those obsidian eyes, and he saw something flicker in their depths, not gratitude, but something sharper, more dangerous. "I know what I am," she said quietly, "and I know what I'm not." The words hung between them like a challenge, and Ezekiel realized that he had underestimated this small girl who had been sold for $1. There was steel in her, hidden beneath the surface like veins of silver in mountain rock. That night, as they sat by the fire, Ezekiel found himself talking. He told her about the war, about the battles he'd fought, and the men he'd killed. He told her about Sarah, his wife, and how she'd died while he was away fighting someone else's war. He told her about Thomas, his son, and how the boy had looked so small in the grave beside his mother. Ayanna listened without judgment, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight like mirrors. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "My mother died when I was born," she said finally. "My father said I killed her, that I was born covered in her blood. He said I was cursed. Do you believe that?" She considered the question with the seriousness of a philosopher. "I believe we are what we choose to become." Curses and blessings are words people use when they don't want to take responsibility for their choices. The wisdom in her words struck him like a physical blow. This child, this girl who had been sold like livestock, possessed an understanding of the world that he had lost somewhere in the mud of Virginia. Days passed, then weeks, and a routine developed between them. Ezekiel would descend into the mines at dawn, spending his days in the darkness, pulling silver from the earth's bones. Ayanna would transform his cabin into something resembling a home, preparing meals that gradually became more elaborate, more sophisticated, as if she were conducting experiments in hospitality. But it was the evenings that revealed the true nature of their relationship. As they sat by the fire, Ezekiel began teaching her things that went beyond domestic skills. He showed her how to read the weather in the clouds, how to track animals through the forest, how to identify plants that could heal and those that could kill. He taught her about the war, about strategy and tactics, about the ways men thought and fought and died. In return, Ayanna shared the knowledge of her people. She showed him how to move through the forest without disturbing so much as a leaf, how to read the stories written in animal tracks, how to find water in the desert and shelter in the storm. She taught him the Lakota words for things he'd never had names for, the specific quality of light just before dawn, the sound wind makes when it mourns, the way a warrior's spirit looks when it prepares for battle. "Why are you teaching me these things?" she asked one evening as they practiced. knife fighting in the cabin's small space. Ezekiel paused, his own blade held at an angle that would have been lethal if this had been real combat. Because knowledge is the only thing that can't be taken from you. Men can steal your freedom, your family, your dignity. But what you know, what you understand, what you can do, that belongs to you forever. She absorbed this lesson like she absorbed all the others, completely and without question. But there was something else in her eyes now, something that hadn't been there when he'd first brought her home. It was the look of someone who was beginning to understand her own potential. Transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic. It was gradual, like the way winter slowly gave way to spring, or the way a blade was forged through repeated heating and hammering. Each day, Ayanna grew a little stronger, a little more skilled, a little more dangerous. She learned to throw knives with deadly accuracy, to set traps that could catch anything from rabbits to men, to fight with the fluid grace of someone who understood violence as a language rather than a last resort. But it was her mind that impressed Ezekiel most. She absorbed information like a sponge, connecting disparate facts into patterns that revealed larger truths. She could read men's intentions in their posture, predict their actions from their habits, understand their weaknesses from their strengths. She learned to play chess, and within a month, she was beating Ezekiel more often than not. "You're different," he told her one evening as they sat by the fire, her latest victory still fresh between them. "Different how?" "Most people learn to survive. You're learning to conquer." She considered this, her small hands folded in her lap like a lady in a drawing room. But there was nothing ladylike about the way she held herself, the coiled tension in her slight frame that suggested she could explode into violence at any moment. "Is that bad?" she asked. Ezekiel looked at her, this girl who had been sold for $1 and was becoming something that couldn't be bought at any price. "That depends on what you plan to conquer." Winter deepened around Blackwater Creek, and the mountains became a fortress of snow and ice. The mines operated on reduced schedules, and men spent more time in the saloons, drinking away their cabin fever and their memories. Ezekiel found himself spending more time in the cabin, which meant more time training Ayanna, more time watching her transform from a frightened child into something else entirely. She was 8 years old now, but she moved with the confidence of someone twice her age. Her eyes had lost the last vestiges of childhood innocence, replaced by the calculating gaze of a predator. She could field dress a deer, set a bone, pick a lock, and kill a man with equal efficiency. She spoke 4 languages fluently and could read the complex equations in Ezekiel's engineering books, but it was her understanding of human nature that marked her as truly extraordinary. She could read people like books, understanding their motivations, their fears, their desires with an accuracy that bordered on the supernatural. She knew which men in town were brave and which were cowards, which could be trusted and which would sell their mothers for a drink. "You're ready," Ezekiel told her one evening as they sat by the fire, watching the flames dance against the stone. "Ready for what?" "To choose who you want to be." Ayanna looked at him with those obsidian eyes, and he saw in them the reflection of everything he had taught her, everything she had learned, everything she had become. She was no longer the frightened child who had been sold for $1. She was something new, something dangerous, something that the world had never seen before. "I already know who I am," she said quietly. "The question is whether the world is ready for me." Outside, the wind howled through the mountains like a warning, and Ezekiel realized that he had created something magnificent and terrible. He had taken a broken child and forged her into a weapon that could cut through the very fabric of the world they knew. The girl who had been bought for $1 was gone, replaced by something that couldn't be bought at any price. And as he looked into her eyes, Ezekiel wondered if he had saved her or simply created the instrument of his own destruction. Spring arrived in Blackwater Creek, with the suddenness of a gunshot, melting the winter's grip on the mountains and sending torrents of ice-cold water cascading down the rocky slopes. The creek that gave the town its name swelled beyond its banks, turning the main street into a river of mud and broken dreams. But it wasn't the changing season that brought transformation to the mining settlement. It was the arrival of Marcus. Dalton and his band of territorial enforcers. Dalton rode into town on a stallion black as sin, his silver spurs catching the morning light like warning signals. Behind him came 12 men, each one handpicked for their particular skills in the art of intimidation. They wore the unofficial uniform of corporate muscle-dark suits over gun leather, polished boots caked with the dust of 100 conquered towns and eyes that had seen too much violence to be troubled by conscience. The Consolidated Mining Corporation had sent them to bring order to Blackwater Creek, which in their language meant squeezing every last ounce of profit from the earth. And the men who worked it. Independent miners like Ezekiel were obstacles to be removed, their claims to be absorbed into the corporate machine that was devouring the American West one settlement at a time. Ayanna watched from the cabin window as the enforcers established their headquarters in the largest building on Main Street, evicting the hardware store owner and his family with the casual brutality of men who had performed this routine in dozens of towns before. She was 9 years old now, her slight frame beginning to show the first hints of the woman she would become. But her eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had learned to see the world as a battlefield. "They're here for the claims," she said without turning from the window. Ezekiel looked up from the newspaper he'd been reading, his massive hands dwarfing the printed pages. "What makes you say that? The way they move. The way they look at the buildings, the mine entrances, the people. They're not here to keep the peace. They're here to take possession." She was right, of course. She was always right about these things now, her understanding of human nature honed to a razor's edge through 2 years of intensive training. Ezekiel had taught her to read people like topographical maps, to understand the terrain of their ambitions and the geography of their fears. "What do you think they'll do first?" he asked, genuinely curious about her assessment. Ayanna turned from the window, her dark hair catching the light in a way that reminded him of her mother's people, of the proud warriors who had once ruled these mountains before the white man's hunger had consumed everything in its path. "They'll start with the weakest," she said with the clinical detachment of a general discussing battle strategy. "The men who are afraid, who have families to protect, who can be bought or intimidated. They'll make examples of them and show others what happens to those who resist. And then they'll come for you." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Ezekiel felt something cold settle in his stomach, not fear exactly, but the recognition of an inevitable confrontation. He had fought in the war, had killed men with his bare hands, had survived battles that claimed thousands of lives. But this was different. This was personal. Why me specifically? Ayanna moved away from the window, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She had learned to walk like her ancestors, to move without disturbing the world around her, to become invisible when invisibility was survival. "Because you're the strongest," she said simply. "The other miners look up to you, respect you. If they can break you, they break the town spirit. If they can single quotes double quotes," she paused, her obsidian eyes meeting his, "then they'll have to kill you." The brutal simplicity of her logic struck him like a physical blow. In 2 years, she had learned not just to fight and survive, but to think like a warrior, to understand the psychology of conquest and resistance. She saw the world as a chess game where lives were pieces to be sacrificed for larger strategic goals. "And what would you do?" he asked carefully, "if they killed me?" Ayanna's smile was sharp as a blade's edge, holding promises of violence that would make strong men wake screaming from their sleep. "I would show them why my people painted their faces before going to war." The next morning brought the first casualty of Dalton's campaign. Old Henrik Nordstrom, a Norwegian immigrant who had worked the same small claim for 15 years, was found hanging from the support beam of his cabin. The official story was suicide, brought on by despair over his failing mine and mounting debts. But the bruises on his knuckles and the defensive wounds on his arms told a different tale to those who knew how to read the language of violence. Ezekiel and Ayanna attended the funeral, standing at the back of the small crowd that had gathered in the cemetery overlooking the creek. The preacher spoke words about salvation and eternal rest, but his voice shook with the knowledge that Henrik's death was merely the opening note in a symphony of destruction. 3 more will die this week, Ayanna whispered as they watched the coffin being lowered into the rocky ground. The ones who saw too much, who might talk too much, who represent loose ends that need to be tied off. She was right again. By Friday, 2 more independent miners had met with unfortunate accidents, one crushed by a cave-in that seemed suspiciously well-timed, another shot by claim jumpers who disappeared into the mountains like smoke. The message was clear: submit, or join the growing population of Blackwater Creek Cemetery. It was on Saturday night that Marcus Dalton made his move against Ezekiel. The enforcer chose Murphy's Saloon as his stage, understanding that any confrontation needed witnesses to achieve maximum psychological impact. He entered the establishment with the confidence of a man who had never lost a fight, his silver spurs announcing his presence like the tolling of a death knell. The saloon fell silent as he approached Ezekiel's corner table, the usual crowd of miners and drifters suddenly finding urgent business elsewhere. Even Mickey Murphy retreated behind his bar, his Irish face pale with the knowledge that he was about to witness something that would change the town forever. Ezekiel Thorne, Dalton said, his voice carrying the educated accent of a man who had been born to wealth and privilege. I've been looking forward to meeting you. Ezekiel didn't look up from his whiskey glass, his massive hands steady despite the tension that filled the room like smoke from a wildfire. Can't say the same. Dalton laughed, the sound sharp and brittle as breaking glass. I like a man with backbone. Makes the breaking that much more satisfying. Now Ezekiel did look up, his dark eyes meeting Dalton's with the level gaze of a man who had stared death in the face and found it wanting. What do you want, Dalton? Your claim. Your cooperation. Your submission. Dalton's smile was cold as the winter wind. The Consolidated Mining Corporation is prepared to offer you a very generous sum for your holdings. Enough to set you up comfortably somewhere else, far from the dangers of frontier life. And if I refuse, then you'll discover just how dangerous frontier life can be. The threat hung in the air like the smell of cordite after gunfire. Every man in the saloon understood the stakes, understood that they were witnessing the moment when the old ways would either stand or fall before the advance of corporate power. Ezekiel stood slowly, his massive frame unfolding like a mountain, deciding to walk. At 6 feet 8 inches, he towered over Dalton, but the enforcer showed no sign of intimidation. If anything, his smile grew wider, as if he had been hoping for exactly this response. I fought in the war, Ezekiel said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of battlefields and buried friends. I've killed men with my bare hands, watched cities burn, seen the best and worst of what humanity can do to itself. You think your corporate masters scare me? I think, Dalton replied, that you're about to learn the difference between fighting soldiers and fighting professionals. The attack came without warning, Dalton's knife appearing in his hand like a magician's trick. The blade flashed toward Ezekiel's throat, seeking the major artery that would end the confrontation in seconds. But Ezekiel's war-trained reflexes were faster, his massive hand closing around Dalton's wrist with the sound of breaking bone. The enforcer's scream echoed off the saloon walls as Ezekiel's grip tightened, grinding the shattered bones together like millstones. The knife clattered to the floor, forgotten in the face of pain that transcended rational thought. You made a mistake, Ezekiel said, his voice calm despite the violence of the moment. You thought because I'm a miner, I'd forgotten how to be a soldier. He lifted Dalton off his feet one-handed, the enforcer's expensive boots kicking uselessly in the air. The other patrons of the saloon watched in stunned silence as the giant held the corporate killer like a child holding a rag doll. Tell your masters, Ezekiel continued, his grip shifting to Dalton's throat, that some things can't be bought. Some men can't be broken, and some fights aren't worth starting. He released his grip, letting Dalton crash to the floor in a heap of expensive clothes and shattered pride. The enforcer gasped for air, his face purple with strangulation and humiliation. Get out, Ezekiel said simply. All of you. Leave this town and don't come back. Dalton struggled to his feet, his broken wrist cradled against his chest like a wounded bird. His eyes burned with the fury of a man who had never been defeated, never been humiliated, never been shown his own mortality with such brutal clarity. This isn't over, he wheezed through his damaged throat. The corporation doesn't forget. The corporation doesn't forgive. Neither do I, Ezekiel replied. Dalton stumbled from the saloon, his remaining enforcers helping him to his horse. As they rode out of town, their retreat marked by the sound of hoofbeats fading into the mountain darkness, the patrons of Murphy's saloon slowly began to realize what they had witnessed. They had seen a man stand up to the corporate machine and win. But Ayanna, watching from the shadows outside the saloon, understood the larger truth. This wasn't a victory, it was a declaration of war. And wars, she had learned, were won not by the strongest or the bravest, but by those who understood the true nature of power and were willing to use it without mercy. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Joseph Crow Feather was found dead in his shack on the outskirts of town, his throat cut from ear to ear. Beside his body lay a note, written in Dalton's educated hand, "The girl is next." Ezekiel found Ayanna standing over her father's corpse, her dark eyes dry as desert stones. She showed no emotion, no grief, no anger, just the cold calculation of someone who had learned to see death as another tool in the arsenal of survival. "I'm sorry," Ezekiel said, the words inadequate in the face of such loss. "Don't be," Ayanna replied, her voice steady as mountain stone. "He died the night he sold me. This is just when his body caught up with his spirit." She knelt beside the corpse, her small hands moving with practiced efficiency as she closed his eyes and folded his hands across his chest. When she stood, she was holding something that gleamed in the morning light, a silver dollar, the same coin that had changed hands 2 years ago. "He kept it," she said, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been surprising. "All this time he kept it. What are you going to do with it?" Ayanna looked at the coin, then at her father's body, then at the message that promised her death. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of prophecy. "I'm going to give it back to them," she said, with interest. That night, as Ezekiel slept the uneasy sleep of a man who knows his enemies are gathering, Ayanna slipped from the cabin like a ghost made of moonlight and shadow. She moved through the forest with the silence of her ancestors, her bare feet finding purchase on rocks and roots that would have sent lesser mortals tumbling into the abyss. She had learned many things in the 2 years since Ezekiel had bought her for $1. She had learned to read and write, to fight and heal, to think and plan and execute strategies that would make generals weep with envy. But most importantly, she had learned to become invisible, to move through the world like smoke, to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The Consolidated Mining Corporation had sent 12 enforcers to Blackwater Creek. By morning, there would be 11. And by the time the sun set again, Marcus Dalton would understand that some debts could only be paid in blood. The war for Blackwater Creek had begun, and the girl who had been bought for $1 was about to show the world what she had become worth. The fourth enforcer, seeing his companions destroyed with such casual brutality, turned to run. He made it 3 steps before Ezekiel's thrown whiskey glass caught him in the back of the head, the heavy crystal exploding in a shower of blood and glass fragments that painted the wall in abstract patterns of violence. Marcus Dalton found himself alone, his broken wrist throbbing and his remaining men scattered like leaves before a hurricane. He reached for his gun with his good hand, but Ezekiel was already moving, crossing the distance between them with surprising speed for such a large man. The impact when Ezekiel's fist connected with Dalton's jaw was like the sound of a tree falling in the forest. The corporate enforcer spun through the air, his expensive clothes torn and bloodied, before crashing into a table that exploded into splinters beneath his weight. "You want to threaten children?" Ezekiel asked, standing over Dalton's broken form. "You want to bring your corporate war to innocent people?" Dalton tried to speak, but his jaw hung at an unnatural angle, held in place only by skin and sinew. Blood frothed from his mouth as he attempted to form words, his eyes wide with the terror of a man who had finally met something stronger than corporate authority. Ezekiel reached down and grabbed Dalton by the front of his ruined shirt, lifting him until they were face to face. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing a sentence. "You're going to leave this town. You're going to take whatever men you have left, and you're going to ride out of here like the devil himself is chasing you. And if I ever see you or any other corporate enforcer in Blackwater Creek again, I'll kill you all with my bare hands." He released his grip, letting Dalton fall to the floor in a heap of expensive cloth and shattered pride. The corporate killer lay there for a moment, gasping like a fish out of water, before somehow finding the strength to crawl toward the door. But even as Dalton dragged himself across the blood-stained floor, Ezekiel knew that this wasn't over. The corporation didn't forget insults, didn't forgive resistance, didn't accept defeat at the hands of independent miners in frontier settlements. They would be back, and when they came, they would bring enough firepower to level the entire town. As if reading his thoughts, Ayanna appeared in the saloon doorway, her small form silhouetted against the evening sky. She looked at the carnage with the detached interest of a scholar examining historical artifacts, her dark eyes cataloging the bodies and the blood with clinical precision. "How many are left?" she asked. "6, Ezekiel replied, "not counting Dalton." She nodded, already calculating odds and probabilities, already planning the next phase of a war that had escalated beyond anyone's expectations. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had learned to command through competence rather than bluster. "They'll send reinforcements. Telegraph wires run through Silver Junction, 20 miles south. If we can cut the lines and eliminate the remaining enforcers before dawn, we'll have maybe a week before the corporation realizes what's happened." "And then?" Ayanna's smile was sharp as the winter wind, holding promises of violence that would make strong men wake screaming from their dreams. "Then we show them what happens when you threaten the people under our protection." Outside, Marcus Dalton managed to drag himself onto his horse, his broken body screaming with every movement. As he rode out of Blackwater Creek, leaving behind a trail of blood and shattered dreams, he carried with him the knowledge that he had awakened something terrible. The girl who had been bought for $1 was no longer content to hide in the shadows. The war was about to begin in earnest, and the mountains themselves would run red with blood before it ended. The telegraph lines to Silver Junction died at midnight, severed by hands that moved like whispers through the darkness. Ayanna had studied the infrastructure for weeks, mapping every pole, every connection, every point where the corporate lifeline could be severed. She didn't just cut the wires, she destroyed entire sections, pulling down poles and burying the equipment in places where it would take weeks to find and repair. By dawn, Blackwater Creek was as isolated as an island in a storm-tossed sea. The remaining 6 enforcers had barricaded themselves in the hotel, turning the second floor into a fortress of overturned furniture and shattered glass. They had ammunition, supplies, and the desperate courage of men who knew they were fighting for their lives. What they didn't have was any understanding of what they were truly facing. Samuel Crawford, the senior surviving enforcer, stood at the window watching the empty street below. He was a veteran of corporate wars, a man who had broken strikes and crushed resistance movements from California to Colorado. But this felt different. This felt personal in a way that transcended business. Interests in quarterly profits. "How many do you think are out there?" asked Jimmy Kelso, the youngest of the surviving men. His hands shook as he loaded cartridges into his rifle, the brass cases rattling against each other like dice in a gambler's cup. "Doesn't matter," Crawford replied, though his own voice betrayed the confidence he was trying to project. "We hold this position until reinforcements arrive. Corporate knows where we are, knows what we're dealing with. They'll send help." But even as he spoke the words, Crawford knew they were hollow. The telegraph lines were down, the roads were treacherous, and the corporation had no idea that their enforcement team was being systematically destroyed by forces they couldn't identify or comprehend. Outside, Ayanna moved through the town like smoke given form. She had spent the pre-dawn hours setting her trap, a web of carefully placed charges and strategically positioned snares that would turn Blackwater Creek into a killing ground. She had learned demolition from Ezekiel's engineering books, studying the principles of structural collapse and controlled destruction with the same intensity she had once applied to tracking wounded deer through mountain forests. The first explosion came at 8 in the morning, taking out the hotel's rear wall in a shower of brick and mortar. The blast was precisely calculated, enough to create chaos and confusion, not enough to bring down the entire building. Ayanna wanted them alive when she came for them, and wanted them to understand exactly who was hunting them through the rubble. And smoke. The enforcers stumbled through the debris, their ears ringing from the concussion, their eyes streaming from the dust and smoke. Crawford tried to maintain order, shouting commands that were lost in the aftermath of the explosion, but discipline was fragmenting as quickly as the walls around them. "The stairs," gasped Morton Webb, pointing toward the front of the building. "We need to get to the ground floor. Get out of this death trap." But as they moved toward the staircase, the second charge detonated. This one had been placed with surgical precision beneath the main support beam, causing the stairs to collapse. In a cascade of splintered wood and twisted metal, the enforcers found themselves trapped on the second floor, cut off from escape, surrounded by smoke and confusion. That was when Ayanna made her entrance. She came through the hole in the rear wall like an avenging spirit, her slight form seeming to materialize from the smoke itself. In her hands were the twin knives that Ezekiel had forged for her in his makeshift smithy, the blades catching what little light penetrated the dust-filled air. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to see violence as a form of art, each step calculated, each movement economical and deadly. Jimmy Kelso saw her first and tried to bring his rifle around, but she was already moving, covering the distance between them in 3 silent strides. Her knife opened his throat with clinical precision, the blade sliding between vertebrae to sever the spinal cord. He dropped without a sound, his weapon clattering uselessly to the floor. The others turned at the noise, their weapons swinging toward where she had been, but Ayanna was no longer there. She had learned to use the terrain to her advantage, disappearing behind fallen beams and overturned furniture, becoming one with the shadows and smoke. "Where is she?" Crawford shouted, his voice cracking with strain. "Where the hell is she?" His answer came in the form of Morton Webb's scream, a sound that cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. They found him pinned to the wall by a knife through his chest, the blade driven with such force that it had penetrated the wooden paneling behind him. His eyes were wide with shock and pain, his mouth working soundlessly as his life poured out through the wound. "She's just a girl," whispered Frank Morrison, the man who had first suggested Ayanna might be responsible for the killings. She's..." Just a goddamn girl. But the thing that stalked them through the ruins of the hotel was no longer a girl, if it ever had been. It was something else, something that had learned to wear human form while harboring the soul of a predator. It moved through the smoke and debris with the confidence of something that owned the darkness, that had made the shadows into allies and the chaos into a weapon. The third enforcer died trying to escape through a window, Ayanna's blade finding the space between his ribs as he struggled with the broken glass. He fell backward into the room, his hands clutching at the wound, his eyes already glazing over with the approach of death. "Absolutely not," Bancroft interrupted, his military bearing rigid with offended pride. "We cannot allow ourselves to be dictated to by a single terrorist, regardless of her capabilities. I'll organize a proper military expedition, 50 men. Modern weapons, artillery, if necessary. We'll level that entire settlement and make an example that will discourage further resistance." Crawford's laugh was sharp and bitter as breaking glass. "50 men, Colonel. 100? You still don't understand what you're dealing with. She's not just a person, she's become an idea. And ideas can't be killed with bullets or buried under artillery shells." The argument that followed lasted for hours, board members and advisors debating strategies and contingencies, while Crawford sat in silence, his bandaged hands resting on the table like talismans of corporate failure. Finally, Whitmore called for a vote, and the corporation's fate was decided by narrow margins and bitter divisions. They would send the expedition. Colonel Bancroft would lead 200 men into the Colorado mountains, equipped with the latest weapons and backed by unlimited corporate resources. Blackwater Creek would be eliminated as a symbol of resistance, its example erased from the map along with everyone who lived there. Crawford said nothing as the meeting dissolved into logistics and supply discussions. He had delivered his warning and had tried to explain the nature of the force they were about to unleash upon themselves. But men like these had never learned to listen, had never understood that some storms couldn't be weathered, only survived. As he left the building, Crawford felt the silver dollar in his pocket, the coin that Ayanna had pressed into his bleeding palm as a message to his masters. He had kept it as a reminder, a talisman of the moment when the corporate machine had finally encountered something it couldn't digest. Now he wondered if it was also his death warrant. Back in Blackwater Creek, life had settled into a new rhythm, shaped by the knowledge that war was coming. The townspeople went about their daily routines with the careful efficiency of people who understood that normalcy was temporary, that the storm gathering on the horizon would soon break over their heads with corporate fury. Ayanna had spent the months since the hotel incident preparing for what she knew was inevitable. The corporation couldn't afford to let Blackwater Creek stand as an example of successful resistance. Their entire business model depended on the perception that opposition was futile, that individual communities couldn't stand against industrial power. She had transformed the town into a fortress, using Ezekiel's engineering knowledge and her own tactical brilliance to create defensive positions that turned every building into a potential killing ground. She had taught the miners to fight, not as individuals, but as a coordinated unit that could move and strike with the precision of a military formation. But most importantly, she had learned to see the larger picture, to understand that this battle was part of a war that extended far beyond the boundaries of a single mining town. The corporation represented something that was spreading across the American West like a disease, the reduction of human beings to economic units, the transformation of communities into profit centers, the substitution of corporate will for individual choice. "They're coming," Ezekiel said one morning as he returned from his daily reconnaissance of the mountain passes. "Scouts spotted a column moving up from the south, more men than I've ever seen in one place." Ayanna nodded without surprise. She had been expecting this, and had felt it approaching like a storm front visible on the horizon long before it arrived. How many? At least 200, maybe more. Professional soldiers, not enforcement thugs. They're bringing artillery, supply wagons, everything needed for an extended siege. She considered this information with the calm detachment of a general receiving intelligence reports. In the years since Ezekiel had bought her for $1, she had learned to think strategically, to see beyond immediate tactical considerations to the larger implications of every move and countermove. "Good," she said finally. Ezekiel stared at her, unable to comprehend how the approach of overwhelming enemy forces could be considered good news. "Ayanna, they have enough firepower to level this entire town. We can't fight an army with hunting rifles and mining explosives." She turned to look at him, and he saw something in her obsidian eyes that he had never seen before. Not just confidence, but certainty. The absolute knowledge of someone who had calculated all possibilities and found her path through the chaos. "We're not going to fight an army," she said quietly. "We're going to destroy a myth." The corporate expedition reached the outskirts of Blackwater Creek on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, their military precision evident in the organized columns and coordinated movements. Colonel Bancroft had positioned his forces with textbook efficiency, establishing artillery emplacements on the high ground, while deploying infantry in overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach to the town. From a military perspective, it was a perfect siege. The townspeople were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded by professional soldiers who had experience in similar operations. Resistance should have been brief and futile, ending with unconditional surrender and the systematic elimination of anyone who had participated in the earlier attacks on corporate personnel. What Bancroft hadn't anticipated was that he wasn't fighting a conventional battle. The first indication that something was wrong came when his scouts failed to return from their reconnaissance missions. Then supply wagons began disappearing on the mountain roads, their contents vanishing into the wilderness along with their guards. Equipment malfunctioned with suspicious frequency, and sentries reported strange sounds in the darkness, whispers that seemed to come from the mountains themselves. "It's psychological warfare," Bancroft explained to his officers during their third council of war. "The enemy is trying to demoralize us before the real fighting begins." But as the days passed, the expedition's problems multiplied exponentially. Food stores became contaminated with substances that caused violent illness. Water sources were poisoned with compounds that turned drinking into an exercise in Russian roulette. Men began disappearing from their posts, sometimes individually, sometimes in groups, leaving behind only their weapons and the growing certainty that they were being hunted by something that understood the mountains better than they understood themselves. Ayanna moved through the corporate forces like a ghost seeking vengeance, striking with surgical precision before melting back into terrain that seemed to shift and change around her. She had learned every trail, every cave, every hidden path in the surrounding wilderness, transforming the mountains themselves into weapons against the invaders. But her greatest asset wasn't her knowledge of the terrain, it was her understanding of the men she was fighting. Corporate soldiers were disciplined and well-trained, but they were also predictable, following doctrine and procedures that could be anticipated and countered by someone who understood their institutional thinking. She began targeting officers first, eliminating the command structure that held the expedition together. Colonel Bancroft's lieutenants died in their sleep, their throats opened by blades that moved like whispers through the darkness. Supply sergeants vanished while inventorying equipment, leaving behind only bloodstains and the growing realization that the expedition was losing more than just personnel. It was losing its ability to function as a cohesive unit. The psychological impact was devastating. Professional soldiers who had fought in conventional wars found themselves facing an enemy that refused to follow the rules, that struck without warning and disappeared without trace. They began to see threats in every shadow, to hear death approaching. In every sound the wind carried through the mountain passes. "We need to withdraw," Captain Harrison told Bancroft during what would be their final planning session. We're losing men faster than we can count them, and morale is collapsing. The troops are starting to talk about desertion. Bancroft's military. Pride rebelled against the suggestion. We have overwhelming numerical superiority. 200 trained soldiers against a handful of miners and one terrorist. Withdrawal is not an option. Then we're all going to die up here, Harrison replied with the blunt honesty of a man who had seen too much death to care about military courtesy. This isn't terrorism, it's extermination. She's not trying to drive us away. She's trying to kill every single one of us. That night, Ayanna proved Harrison's assessment correct. She came for Colonel Bancroft in his command tent, moving through the sentry lines like smoke through a forest fire. The guards never saw her coming, never had time to cry out a warning, never knew what had killed them until they felt the steel sliding between their ribs. Bancroft woke to find her standing over his cot, her slight form silhouetted against the canvas walls of the tent. In her hand was the silver dollar that had started everything, the coin catching the lamplight and throwing it back in sharp, glittering fragments. "You should have listened to Crawford," she said softly, her voice carrying the musical cadence of her native tongue, wrapped around English syllables. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, carrying implications that went far beyond simple business negotiations. Manchester had used this approach in dozens of similar situations, establishing the framework for discussions that inevitably led to corporate acquisition of whatever resources were being contested. But Ayanna's response wasn't what she had expected. "You're absolutely right," Ayanna said, leaning back in her chair with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Everything is for sale. The question is whether you can afford the price." Manchester felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain. Air drifting through the saloon's open windows. There was something in Ayanna's tone, something that suggested the negotiation was about to take directions that corporate training hadn't prepared her for. "What price did you have in mind?" Manchester asked carefully. "Your life." The words were spoken with such casual precision that it took Manchester a moment to process their meaning. When understanding finally dawned, she felt her carefully maintained composure crack like ice under pressure. "I beg your pardon?" Ayanna's smile widened, becoming something that belonged in nightmares rather than business meetings. "You asked what price I would demand for the mineral rights in this territory. I told you, your life. The lives of everyone who works for the syndicate. The life of the organization itself. That's the only currency I'm interested in accepting." Manchester's hand moved instinctively toward the derringer concealed in her purse, but stopped when she noticed that every person in the saloon was now openly watching their conversation. More importantly, she realized that several of the patrons had positioned themselves in ways that would make escape impossible. "You're threatening me," she said, her voice struggling to maintain its professional calm. "I'm educating you," Ayanna corrected. "You came here representing an organization that believes everything can be bought, that every person has a price, that money can solve any problem and overcome any resistance. I'm explaining why you're wrong." She reached across the table and picked up one of Manchester's documents, scanning the legal language with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read corporate intentions in the spaces between words. "Mineral extraction rights," she read aloud. "Exclusive development privileges. Eminent domain authorization for infrastructure development. Population relocation assistance." She looked up at Manchester, her dark eyes reflecting the gaslight. "Like black mirrors. You're not here to buy mining rights. You're here to steal an entire territory and everyone in it." Manchester's professional mask slipped further, revealing the calculating predator beneath. "The syndicate has legal authority to develop this region for the greater good. We're offering fair compensation for necessary relocations." Necessary for whom? For progress, for civilization, for the advancement of American industrial capacity. Ayanna set the document back on the table with the gentle precision of someone handling a poisonous snake. And what happens to the people? Who don't want to progress? Who prefers their own definition of civilization? Who think American industrial capacity has advanced quite enough? Thank you. Manchester's answer came without hesitation, delivered with the cold certainty of someone who had overseen similar operations dozens of times before. They learn to adapt to changing circumstances. Those who refuse to adapt face the consequences of their intransigence. The saloon fell silent except for the creak of settling timber and the whisper of wind through the gaps in the walls. Ayanna sat perfectly still, her slight frame radiating a tension that made the air itself seem dangerous. Consequences, she repeated, as if tasting the word and finding it bitter. You know, Ms. Manchester, I've become something of an expert on consequences over the years. Would you like me to share some of what I've learned? Before Manchester could answer, Ayanna continued, her voice taking on the rhythmic quality of someone reciting a litany of the dead. I learned that Marcus Dalton died 6 months after leaving this territory, found in a Denver alley with his throat cut. The killer was never identified, but witnesses reported seeing a small woman with dark hair leaving the scene. I learned that Colonel Bancroft's expedition was officially classified as lost to hostile Indian action, but corporate investigators found evidence of systematic elimination by a single individual using advanced tactical knowledge. I learned that the Consolidated Mining Corporation quietly abandoned all expansion plans for this region after losing 200 men and equipment worth more than most companies earn in a decade. Most importantly, I learned that some consequences compound over time, growing stronger rather than weaker, until they become forces that reshape the world around them. Manchester felt sweat beading on her forehead, despite the mountain coolness. Every instinct she had developed in years of corporate warfare was screaming warnings, but she was trapped by circumstances and protocol, forced to see this negotiation through to its conclusion. "What are you proposing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not proposing anything," Ayanna replied. "I'm stating facts. The Transcontinental Development Syndicate will withdraw from this territory permanently. You will return to your superiors and inform them that any attempt to establish operations here will result in the complete destruction of their organization. And you will carry a message for me." She reached into her jacket and withdrew something that caught the gaslight, not a weapon, but a photograph. She placed it on the table between them, and Manchester found herself looking at an image that defied explanation. The photograph showed a group of men in corporate attire, standing beside surveying equipment in what appeared to be a mountain valley. But their faces had been systematically destroyed, not by time or accident, but by something sharp and deliberate. Each face bore the same mark, a thin line drawn from ear to ear, precise as a surgeon's incision. "These men arrived in our territory 3 weeks ago," Ayanna explained with clinical detachment. "They were conducting preliminary surveys for railroad development, working under contracts issued by your syndicate. I'm returning them to you." Manchester stared at the photograph, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. You killed them all. I educated them about the consequences of trespassing. Unfortunately, they weren't fast learners. The corporate negotiator felt her carefully constructed world shifting beneath her feet like sand in an earthquake. She had built her career on the assumption that violence was a tool to be used by organizations against individuals, that corporate power was always superior to personal resistance. But the woman sitting across from her represented something entirely outside that framework, an individual backed by competence so absolute that it could stand against institutional power and win. "What message do you want me to carry?" Manchester asked, abandoning any pretense that this was still a business negotiation. Ayanna leaned forward, her dark eyes reflecting the gaslight like mirrors in a charnel house. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had learned to command through demonstrated competence rather than inherited position. Tell them that the girl they tried to buy for $1 has become something that can't be purchased at any price. Tell them that some territories are defended by forces they can't understand, can't predict, and can't overcome. Tell them that if they ever send representatives into my domain again, those representatives will return in photographs. She paused, studying Manchester's pale face with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. Most importantly, tell them that I remember everything. Every corporate action, every enforcement operation, every attempt to reduce human beings to balance sheet entries. And I have become very, very good at collecting debts. Manchester nodded with the mechanical precision of someone who's nervous. System was operating on automatic responses. She gathered her documents with hands that shook despite her efforts to control them, stuffing them into her portfolio without regard for order or organization. One more thing, Ayanna said as Manchester rose to leave. The stagecoach that brought you here, it's not coming back. Neither are the horses, neither are the drivers. You'll be walking out of this territory, Ms. Manchester, and that walk will give you time to consider everything we've discussed today. How am I supposed to reach civilization on foot? Ayanna's smile was sharp as the winter wind, holding promises that made Manchester's blood turn to ice in her veins. Very carefully, the corporate negotiator stumbled from the saloon into the mountain darkness, her expensive clothes already showing the strain of a journey that had barely begun. Behind her, the Silver Crown resumed its normal evening activities, but with an undercurrent of satisfaction that spoke of debts paid and territories defended. Ezekiel emerged from the shadows near the bar, his massive frame moving with the careful precision that had marked his approach to violence since the war. At 45, he had grown into his role as Ayanna's lieutenant and advisor, understanding that his strength complemented her strategic brilliance in ways that made them formidable beyond the sum of their individual capabilities. Think she deliver the message? He asked, settling into the chair Manchester had vacated. She'd deliver it, Ayanna replied with absolute certainty. Fear is a very reliable messenger, and she's carrying enough fear to last the rest of her life. She picked up the photograph and studied it for a moment, remembering the faces of the men who had thought they could survey her territory without permission, who had believed that corporate authority superseded individual sovereignty. They had learned otherwise, but the lesson had cost them everything. What happens now? Ezekiel asked. Ayanna set the photograph aside and returned to her correspondence. Letters from contacts throughout the West who looked to her for guidance and protection. The network she had built over the past decade stretched from California to the Dakota Territory, a shadow organization of individuals and communities who had chosen resistance over submission. Now we wait, she said, signing her name to a letter that would authorize safe passage for a group of displaced miners, fleeing corporate seizure of their claims. And we prepare for whatever comes next. Outside, the mountain wind carried the scent of snow from the high peaks, promising another winter in a territory that had learned to define itself through strength rather than submission. The girl who had been sold for a silver dollar was gone, replaced by something that could reshape the balance of power with a gesture that could defend an entire region through the application of precise and overwhelming violence. In the years to come, when historians attempted to chronicle the corporate wars that shaped the American West, they would struggle to explain how a single person could stand against institutional power and win. They would write about economic factors and political changes, about shifting demographics and technological developments, but they would miss the essential truth that drove everything else. Some people cannot be bought. Some spirits cannot be broken. And some debts can only be paid in blood. The territory that had once been marked for corporate acquisition would remain independent, protected by forces that operated outside the normal rules of industrial civilization. And in the mountain stronghold of Blackwater Creek, a Lakota woman would continue to demonstrate that the most dangerous weapon in any arsenal is a human being who has learned to transform suffering into strength, victimhood into victory, and a single silver dollar into a declaration of war that echoes through eternity. The legend had become reality, and reality had proven more powerful than any corporate dream. Eleanor Manchester's journey back to civilization became a pilgrimage of terror that would haunt her remaining days. The mountain trails that corporate maps had marked as simple transportation routes revealed themselves as labyrinths designed by someone who understood the psychology of pursuit. Every path seemed to lead deeper into wilderness. Every landmark appeared to shift when she wasn't looking directly at it, and every sound in the darkness suggested watchers who remained perpetually out of sight. She rationed her water with the desperation of someone who understood that rescue was not coming, that her survival depended entirely on her ability to navigate terrain that actively resisted her passage. The expensive boots that had been chosen for boardroom negotiations proved utterly inadequate for mountain travel, and within days her feet were bleeding through leather that disintegrated under conditions it had never been designed to endure. But it was the psychological warfare that broke her spirit completely. She would wake each morning to find evidence that someone had visited her camp during the night, her belongings rearranged in subtle patterns that conveyed messages she couldn't decode, her water containers refilled with liquid that tasted of minerals and mountain streams, her meager food supplies supplemented with items that could only have come from someone who understood exactly where she was and what she needed to survive. The message was clear. Her life continued only because someone chose to allow it, and that choice could be revoked at any moment. When Manchester finally stumbled into the railroad town of Silver Junction 3 weeks later, she was no longer the sophisticated corporate operative who had arrived in Blackwater Creek with leather portfolios and acquisition documents. She was something else entirely, a broken woman whose eyes held the hollow emptiness of someone who had stared into an abyss and found it staring back. The Transcontinental Development Syndicate received her report in a Denver hotel room that had been converted into a temporary headquarters. The board members who listened to her account did so with the mounting horror of people discovering that their carefully constructed worldview was built on foundations of sand. "She controls the entire territory," Manchester whispered, her voice hoarse from weeks of mountain air and psychological trauma. "Not just Blackwater Creek, but everything for hundreds of miles in every direction. She has people everywhere, miners, ranchers, merchants, even some of the railroad workers. They don't just respect her, they worship her." Board Chairman Harrison Caldwell studied Manchester's haggard appearance with the clinical detachment of someone calculating losses and liabilities. The syndicate had invested heavily in territorial expansion plans, and the failure of the Blackwater Creek operation represented more than just a setback. It was a fundamental challenge to their business model. "One person cannot control territory of that magnitude," he said finally. "There must be infrastructure, organization, some kind of institutional framework that we can identify and counter." But Manchester was shaking her head with the conviction of someone who had seen truth in its most terrifying form. "You still don't understand. She doesn't need infrastructure, she is the infrastructure. She doesn't require organization, she creates it wherever she goes. People follow her not because they have to, but because they want to, because she represents something they thought they'd lost forever, which is hope." The word hung in the air like an accusation, challenging everything the corporate executives believed about human nature and market forces. In their experience, hope was a commodity that could be manufactured, manipulated, and monetized like any other resource. But the kind of hope that Manchester described was something different, organic, self-sustaining, and apparently immune to corporate influence. "What are you recommending?" asked Patricia Vance, the syndicate's head of strategic planning. Manchester's laugh carried the sharp edge of hysteria barely held in check. "I'm recommending that we forget the Blackwater Creek territory exists. I'm recommending that we write off every investment we've made in that region and never look back. I'm recommending that we find somewhere else to expand, somewhere that doesn't have her." The corporate silence that followed was broken only by the scratch of pens on paper, as secretaries recorded decisions that would reshape the syndicate's expansion strategy for decades to come. The Blackwater Creek territory would be marked on corporate maps with notations that warned against future development attempts, joining a small but growing list of regions that had proven too costly to acquire. But Manchester's ordeal was far from over. In the months that followed her return to civilization, she found herself changed in ways that went beyond simple trauma. She would wake in the middle of the night with the certainty that someone was watching her, would catch glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision that vanished when she turned to look directly. Her apartment in Denver became a fortress of locks and barricades, but security measures provided no comfort against threats that existed more in memory than reality. The other corporate executives began to avoid her, uncomfortable with the constant reminder of their failure and disturbed by her increasingly erratic behavior. She would interrupt board meetings with rambling accounts of mountain sounds that spoke in languages older than English, and would insist that territorial maps were incomplete because they failed to show the invisible boundaries that Ayanna had drawn across the landscape. Within a year, Eleanor Manchester had quietly resigned from the Transcontinental Development Syndicate, citing health concerns that everyone understood, but no one discussed openly. She moved to a small town in eastern Colorado, far from the mountains and the memories they contained, but distance provided no escape from the knowledge that she had encountered something beyond corporate comprehension. Meanwhile, in the mountain stronghold of Blackwater Creek, Ayanna continued to refine the network of resistance that had grown around her like a living organism. Her influence now extended far beyond the boundaries of any single territory, reaching into mining camps and railroad towns, into ranches and farming communities. Wherever people faced the choice between corporate submission and individual sovereignty, she had learned to delegate authority without losing control, to inspire loyalty without demanding subservience, to create organizations that could function independently while remaining connected to her larger vision. The skills that Ezekiel had taught her in their isolated cabin strategy, tactics, human psychology had evolved into something approaching statcraft. Though she ruled through competence rather than title, the correspondence that crossed her desk each day told stories of corporate defeats throughout the American West, mining companies that found their operations mysteriously sabotaged when they attempted to seize independent claims, railroad executives who discovered that key personnel had quietly resigned rather than participate in land seizure operations, territorial governors who learned that certain policies would result in consequences that extended far beyond political considerations. She had become a force of nature disguised as a person, a storm system that corporations learned to navigate around rather than attempt to weather. The methods she employed were precise and economical, a conversation with the right person at the right time, a demonstration of capability that discouraged further resistance, a strategic application of pressure that achieved maximum results with minimum effort. But it was the psychological impact that proved most effective. Corporate executives throughout the West began to understand that certain territories were simply off-limits, that some resistance movements possessed capabilities that transcended normal business calculations. The name Ayanna Thorne became a whispered warning in boardrooms from San Francisco to Chicago, a reminder that not everything could be bought and not everyone could be broken. The silver dollar that had initiated her transformation was long gone, thrown into a mountain canyon as a symbolic gesture of completion. But its legacy lived on in the form of a territory that had learned to defend itself, a people who had discovered that submission was optional, and a woman who had proven that individual will could reshape the balance of power when backed by sufficient skill and determination. As winter settled over the Blackwater Creek territory once again, Ayana stood at the window of her office in the building that had replaced the Silver Crown Saloon, watching snow fall on a landscape that belonged to no corporation, answered to no distant authority, and served only the interests of those who called it home. The girl who had been sold for $1 had become priceless, and the world had learned to pay whatever price she demanded. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.